Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's webinar, Improving Cybersecurity Through Next Generation Network Defenses, brought to you by Dark Reading and Landcope and broadcast by UBM. I'm Tim Wilson, Editor-in-Chief of Dark Reading, and I'll be your moderator today. We have a couple of announcements before we begin. You can participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during this webinar. Just type your question into the Q&A text area located to the right of the presentation window, and then click the Submit button. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides by clicking on the Additional Resources button located below the presentation window. If you're experiencing any technical problems, please visit our webinar help guide by clicking on the Help link below the presentation window. In addition, you can contact our technical support helpline, which is also located in the webinar help guide. And now on to the presentation, Improving Cybersecurity Through Next Generation Network Defenses. We're looking forward to a great discussion today. It's a topic that we hear a lot about at Dark Reading as we cover breaking news. There's an often discussion about social networking or social engineering and issues related around endpoint security. We talk a lot about phishing and that sort of thing. A topic that probably doesn't get enough coverage is the network. How to protect it, how attackers get in through the network, and that sort of thing. And that's what we're going to be covering today. With me today to talk through this topic is our John Sawyer, who's the Senior Security Analyst at InGuardians, and Charles Herring, who's the Consulting Security Architect at Landcope. Let me tell you a little bit about each one of them, and then we'll get started. John Sawyer is a Senior Security Analyst with InGuardians. He specializes in network and applications penetration testing. John's experience in enterprise IT security includes pen testing, system and network hardening, intrusion analysis, and digital forensics. John's been a blogger, writer for Dark Reading for many years, and is one of our most reliable sources on how to get into any particular enterprise. So, hi, John. How you doing?
Hey, Tim. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Our other speaker today is Charles Herring, Consulting Security Architect at Landcope. Charles began his information security career in 2002 as a network security analyst and network security officer with the U.S. Navy. After the Navy, he spent 6 years consulting with the federal government, disaster relief organizations, and enterprises on network security, communication, and process improvement. He's also served as a network security product tester for InfoWorld magazine. Hi, Charles. How you doing?
Hey, good. Thanks. Glad to be here.
Well, we'll start off with a presentation from John. Then we'll hear from Charles, and then we'll have a Q&A session for our audience here. But I want to remind everyone that you can ask questions anytime during the session. So please keep the questions coming, and we hope for an exciting, interesting conversation here at the tail end of the presentation. So I'll hand it over to you, John, to get started.
Thank you, Tim. So as Tim said, my name is John Sawyer. I'm a Senior Security Analyst with InGuardians, and today we want to talk about network attacks, network defenses, and we're going to look at a couple of different methodologies and kind of the attack phases that you see as these attacks take place, what the different 5 stages are. And then we're going to go through some different types of attacks and discuss some stories and some case studies that we've worked with over the years. And then we want to talk about some of the tips and prevention for preventing some of these attacks and trying to keep you from becoming the next headline. Now, after some of that, we'll dig into some more of the technical side of the network defense and see some of the cool things that Landcope has been doing. So the first slide I want to go through is one that talks about the 5 stages of an attack. And when we think about an attack that's going to take place on our network, we don't necessarily know where it's going to come from. It could be a user who has decided to that they're unhappy and they want to start stealing data or deleting data and damaging data because they're unhappy and they want to get back at the company. So it could be something as simple as someone who is unhappy, or it could be that this target that's getting attacked, maybe they're a target of opportunity. An attacker has decided that, hey, I want to look for all of the different Apache servers that are running a version of Apache that I know is vulnerable because a new 0-day maybe was just released in the last 24 hours or so. And so this attacker will scan the internet looking for what we call a target of opportunity. This is just someone who they weren't necessarily the individual that the attacker wanted to attack, but it's someone who was vulnerable and just happened to fall into the target sites of the attacker. Now the other is a target of a specific targeted attack, and that's where we have an attacker who's focused primarily on the end goal of getting into a target network that may have financial gain, or may have trade secrets, or maybe some type of espionage that's going to give a competitive advantage, or maybe they want to destroy a project and gain that advantage over another state, nation state, or company. So as we think about the attack, we see 5 different stages of attacks. We have the recon stage, which is determining what is it we want to attack. Are we finding this out because we saw a company in the headlines that we want to go after? Or maybe it's something that we've seen in the news because they're doing something that we don't necessarily agree with. So we have some hacktivism that takes place. So during that recon stage, it's more of a, what information do we need to then go after this company that's going to be the target? Do we need open source recon, open source intelligence? Are we doing targeted intelligence where we start communicating with the target in some way, maybe calling them up and trying to get information out of their employees to determine what kind of systems they have, what's on their network, what firewalls do they have any IDS or IPS in place? And these are details that we'd want to know, that as we start to attack the network and get in later stages of the attack process, what is it that we need to be worried about that might detect us? Is it maybe a next-gen firewall that they have in place that has something that might detect the attacks or the payloads that we're using? Or maybe they've got some kind of really nice monitoring system in place. This is all part of the recon process, where you want to know as much about your target as possible before getting in. The scanning and identifying vulnerabilities. This is where the attacker is going to go through, and they're going to look for specific issues that may occur in the network that might let them in. Now suppose an attacker was able to gain physical access into your environment and plug in, let's say, to a conference room. Is there any network access controls that are in place to prevent that? Is there any monitoring in place that might detect when they plug in? So this is where, as that attacker is trying to identify vulnerabilities and get in, they're going to start tripping alarms that's going to alert you to know that something is going on. Gaining access, this is the exploitation phase, where the attacker is exploiting a vulnerability that they identified during the scanning phase. And this is where they must start touching the network. There's going to be some type of logs. It could be NetFlow data. It could be access control or deny logs that are occurring in firewalls. It could be signatures or behavioral SIGs that are tripping within an IDS or IPS. These are all things that might come up as someone starts exploiting an issue or a vulnerability inside the network. Maintaining access or persistence. This is where the attacker, of course, wants to get in the network, stay in the network, and be able to continue whatever it is their attack campaign is going to entail. Maybe it's stealing the data. Maybe it's just setting up for a second stage of attack where someone is going to come in and then maybe go after some specific data that they were after. And maybe the first attacker group was simply hired to get that initial access. It's one of the things that we've seen in a couple of investigations where we see attacker groups that are working together. With covering tracks, it's pretty simple there. Clearing logs, using encryption, these are just different things that the attacker is going to do once they get into your network. So just hide their traffic or their activity, or maybe they're persistent mechanisms so that you can't see that once they're in. Now this second slide is going to talk a little bit about the attackers and their objectives. Now, I really just want to cover this briefly. This is a table that I was able to pull from the RSA conference back in early this year, and it's a great table because when you start looking at the threats and the objectives and the examples, it gives a better understanding to some people who really haven't had a chance to think about the threats that are coming at their network. One of the problems that we see over and over is that when we start talking to companies who are looking to secure their networks better, they haven't really thought about who it is that's after their network. They see headlines, they know bad things are going on out in the world, they know there's all these hacks, but they don't understand who it is that would be hacking them, who's going to attack them and try to steal their data. They don't understand whether or not they're a target of opportunity or a target because they have some specific type of information or access that could prove helpful for either the attacker group gaining that initial access or learning additional information that can be used later on down the road once they do have access. And so when we start looking at the network side of things, most of these things are going to have some type of impact on the network, or they're going to leave a trace in the network that's going to allow you to then hopefully track that down as you learn and identify that an event has occurred and you need to dig down into the details and figure out what that event is. Was it truly an incident, and do you need to start diving into your incident response process and figuring out what's going on your network? Now, with the attacker initial foothold slide, I want to highlight several different areas where we've had a lot of success both as a pen testing group, but also these are the same type of attacks that we're seeing every day that our clients and other organizations are coming up against. And these are just the typical users that these are the attacks that are focused on users, and they're focused on your employees, because what we've seen over time is that attackers have found that it's not as easy to get in from the external network, from the outside. Companies have had years, decades to harden the perimeter. They've put in firewalls, they put in IPS, they put all these different things in place to try to harden their network and prevent someone from getting in. But what about the individuals who are already in there? And what we constantly are coming up against is that we have clients who are getting compromised by phishing attacks, most commonly because these are something that target the end user. It's very easy to create. It takes very little effort. And unless you're doing some kind of custom malware from the attacker side that you're going for full stealth and you don't want anyone to know what's going on, phishing is probably one of the easier attacks in here that we come across that has such a huge success. Watering hole attacks is another one. Simply compromising a site that your individuals are going to be, or your target company's employees are going to be coming to. For example, that they have a local restaurant that they go to every Thursday, and someone pulls down the menu that's a PDF. They can infect that PDF. An attacker could have that infected PDF sitting on the website and wait for the right company target to connect in, open the PDF, get compromised on the endpoint. Let's say it installs some memory resident malware that sits there, has a C2 channel or a command and control channel that provides background communications for this zombie node to then start talking into a botnet. And this is something that we see common all the time through phishing and watering hole attacks. The same kind of thing with instant messaging, social networks, same thing, social engineering, targeting the end users. Now, remote exploitation, I mentioned that's one area that's getting more and more difficult to get in from the outside. And we see this both from incident response perspective of where we're looking to see what kind of attacks have occurred, but also from a penetration testing side. We're finding it's more and more difficult to get in simply because they've got these great controls in place. They've started adding in better perimeter controls that then force the attackers to move on to different methods for attack, such as going after specific individuals or physical access. Now, physical access is one that certainly makes it much more difficult. And I think I've got a picture in a slide or two where I can show you a device that gets used quite commonly in pen tests to demonstrate what impact a rogue device would have on a network. And if someone were to plug this device in the network, would you see it? Would you have the monitoring in place to be able to detect that? Do you have NetFlow enabled on all your devices so that there's this audit trail of traffic that's been generated once the device was plugged into the network and started communicating? Or maybe you're monitoring through log entries that would identify that something was simply plugged into the device, whether it's communicating traffic or not. So this is an area to consider within physical access. And then with remote access, we've seen through the Verizon data breach investigation report that practically every compromise that they've investigated that's involved a data breach has involved some type of remote access credentials, which could get them into the VPN, RDP, Citrix. And again, these are all network-based communication protocols. Every single one is going to have a trail that's left on the network from the NetFlow data, from the firewall logs as things, depending on logging, of course, how that's enabled and set up. But there's going to be a trace. You know, if an attacker logs in with these credentials, there's going to be a log there. Now, if you think about the 5 stages of attack, there are going to be efforts to maybe cover tracks and delete some of these logs. But in the case of an environment that has centralized logging, maybe those logs get sent off to the central system prior to an attacker having the ability to clear those tracks. Now, this slide, the purpose of this slide really is to share the painful truth that eventually all successful attackers become insiders at some point. And this is kind of an interesting conversation to have with companies, because they often will say, well, you know, external attackers, and they always focus on the fact that these individuals are outside the network. But once you compromise a system, whether it's a server, desktop, or something that's compromised either through a remote exploit, or maybe you compromise a user workstation through phishing, all of these instances are at that point where an attacker has now gained internal access to your network. So now they're an insider. And this is kind of one of these interesting things where, you know, how many of you already have monitoring and capabilities within your network to identify what would happen if one of these attackers gained network access inside of your corporate environment? Do you have logging in place? Do you have it on the endpoints? Do you have it on all the network devices? Do you have it on all the servers? And with that information that's being logged, do you have it going to a place where you can provide real-time monitoring, or is it after the fact? You know, most of the times that we've done some big cases where a breach has occurred for various reasons, we'll come in and we'll find that logging was enabled, but it didn't go anywhere. Or maybe logging was enabled, or and it was catching the wrong events. You know, that's something where they set up logging and thought, hey, I only need to catch failed logins. Well, what's that going to do? That's going to tell you that, yes, someone's trying a bunch of passwords, but what happens when one of them succeeds? Well, now you know you have a compromised account. So now, once the attacker is in the network, they start moving laterally. And this is where a lot of environments have difficulty with visibility as far as what's going on. There's a ton of visibility on what's going inside or in and out of the network at the perimeter and the gateway, but very little back and forth within the network. So as we see attackers gain access into the network, they start using more and more native tools and leveraging native capabilities within the network and within the host operating systems that they have access to in order to hide themselves. Because if they put some type of file or tool or something that they've maybe downloaded from the internet to run on the system. And this tool might be a legitimate sysadmin tool like PS tools, or it might be a backdoor that they've custom written or something they pulled from some open source security project out there. These things introduce the likelihood that the attacker could get caught. So we're seeing more and more attackers that once they get in, they're leveraging native operating system tools. We see this both in the wild and within the pen testing community, where you have more and more things being developed in PowerShell specifically right now that have the ability to provide encryption, dump passwords from memory, inject credentials into memory, scrape credit card numbers from memory, all these different really powerful features within PowerShell, and they're all built into the native operating system. And it's really just a matter of copying down some of these scripts, and now someone who didn't even know very much about PowerShell has the incredible opportunity to start stealing these things from memory, such as passwords and credit card information. Common sysadmin tools, I mentioned PS tools already, file shares, SharePoint, local file system. These are all different areas that attackers leverage to move laterally within the network. Now, talking about some of the detection and prevention tips, one of the most difficult problems that we run into is that a lot of the individual IT groups that we've worked with, they don't necessarily understand what's going on all the different endpoints in their organization. You ask them to create a baseline, and you end up with a baseline that for 20 different types of systems, when really it would be great if they could have a baseline for a small subset that covers the majority of the systems, or if they are able to have a system that is advanced enough to do individual base profiles for all the individual systems on the network, that's great. The key here is to understand what's normal. What are the normal destinations, websites, hosts, and domains that, let's say, all the client machines on your network are communicating with. If you know that they're always going to the same sites, or they normally communicate with these servers within this time frame, then you can start establishing what's normalized or what's a baseline for those systems. And then when they start to deviate outside those baselines, then something's going on. It's something that needs to be investigated. And it will then start pointing you where do I need to go next. And let's look into some of those areas. Now, one of the first things that we find when we start trying to block attackers throughout the network and as they're moving around laterally is just simple things on the systems that we can do to prevent their lateral movement. Disable remote process and service creation. This one's really simple, and it blocks a lot of things that come across from WMI, PowerShell, and PSExec. Start monitoring for the event, Windows event 7045. That's an interesting one that if you decide that you can't block remote process and service creation, definitely start auditing for this event, because this could show that, hey, we've got a system that's compromised. We have someone who is on one box. They're trying to execute commands on another box. Why are they doing that? It's someone in finance, and they shouldn't be doing that to someone in marketing's system, or someone in finance shouldn't be touching someone in IT's workstation and things like that. Network controls and monitoring. Now, when we start talking about the network segmentation, this is a problem that we run into constantly. An organization will build out their network, and you'll see that this network is perfect for their organization 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But over time, that network has grown organically. They've thrown things in to fix it and never really had the forward-thinking plan of, okay, let's start small with proper network segmentation and then have that where we can build out and grow in the future. No, most of the time we find very flat networks, and When they do have network segmentation, it's just simply logical separation. It's based on subnetting, broadcast domains on local switches and things like that. It doesn't give full segmentation between different sections of the network, such as servers on one side, finance and accounting people, all in their own separate groups and their separate network segments. And so then we would see network security controls like firewall rules or just simple router ACLs that would prevent traffic from, let's say, finance to accounting or accounting to marketing or marketing to developers, that kind of thing. Because why would anyone from finance ever need to get to a developer's workstation? I mean, why wouldn't you already have rules in place to prevent things like that and stop lateral movement? Now that picture right there is an example of a pwn plug that we've used in several different engagements. And what's interesting to see, when you go in and you plug in a rogue device like a pwn plug that is simply just a small Linux computer that's designed to get you access to an internal network, it's interesting to see how many environments actually stop that from being plugged into different places. For example, I would say probably maybe 5% have network access control. Your typical NAC that's using something like 802.1x to prevent devices from connecting in and requiring authentication so that they're getting put into the right place, or maybe it's doing a posture check on the device to make sure it's healthy and has all of its patches and antivirus updates in place. But we don't see that very often. We might see where they will turn off DHCP for hosts that have not been seen before on the network. But even then, that's pretty easy to get by just from passive network analysis. And monitoring these controls can lead to early detection. And unfortunately, we're not seeing probably small and medium companies, size companies that are taking advantage of these things so that they can catch these issues early on before they become a problem. Monitoring privilege groups. This is a very, very good area to keep an eye on in your network, both at the network level and endpoints. Is there features on the endpoints that you're monitoring that's going to keep track of which individuals are logging in? What kind of auditing do you have in place to be able to make sure that domain admins aren't logging into systems that are not typically inside? Would a baseline catch that? That's something that you need to keep in mind as you start monitoring these privilege groups and auditing all of the different logins that are coming in from these different areas. And then a few ounces of prevention. These are just some tips that I like to throw in because they are really good, just kind of standard base system configurations that if you were to just provide a little bit of prevention by enabling principle of least privilege on desktops so that the majority of people in the organization do not have admin access, and even IT, as they're working on their typical everyday user systems, that they're not operating as a domain admin or as root all the time, because what happens if they get compromised? Disabling NetBIOS, LMNR, and WPAD, three great little things that, from an attacker's perspective, give us an easy foothold into a network that we can quickly take advantage of, and often compromise a network within 5 or 10 minutes, if enabled. Disabling Windows local system administrator account. I can't tell you how many times we've gone into pen test and even doing incident response and forensics where we've found that there's a common password used on hundreds or thousands of systems, and once you compromise one, you now have access to all of them. And at that point, it's a sweep, and you can go anywhere you want within the network, and it doesn't matter. Endpoint protection. I put AV on here, and I know a lot of people don't care for AV, but I tell you, it's one of those things that when you look at at all of the defense and depth mechanisms, it just raises the bar a little bit higher. It's going to keep out those more of the target of opportunity hackers and keep them out of your network. And that's it for me. I want to pass it back over to Tim.
Thanks, John. It's always fun to listen to you kind of talk through the options for penetration. I always learn something, and I think it's great to hear you also talk about some of the ways that folks can defend against these various methods and really get a sense for what's available out there. Charles, I'm going to pass it over to you. I want to see if we can get some of your viewpoints on this issue of network defense, and then we'll launch into our Q&A.
Hey, thanks, Tim, and thanks for the brief there, John. I just want to go over some areas where LANCOPE fits into network defense, and even a more broader way of looking at catching and responding to really any type of threat. Back in 1986, Dr. Dorothy Denning wrote a paper that coined the term intrusion detection expert systems, which later became boiled down to IDS, or intrusion detection systems. And there are three different ways we go about detecting something has gone wrong inside of cybersecurity. And they fall into three different buckets: signature, behavioral, and anomaly-based detection. Signature-based detection is the method of inspecting the object either as or after it entered the target or the victim. So in the physical security world, it would be looking at food or material and looking at the food for something that is wrong, mold or a smell or a chemical that we know to be bad. At the airport, coming through security, to looking for certain patterns inside of the object, in this case the passenger, like a bomb or weapon or something along those lines that would be a problem. But on the network, we're looking at packets. We're looking for known bad patterns that would be associated with specific attacks, CVEs against that are targeted against SQL injection or something along those lines. Antivirus, as John mentioned, is a signature-based detection mechanism looking for known bad patterns that have been associated with specific types of malware. Content filtering, looking for specific places on the internet that are known bad. Behavioral-based detection focuses on what the victim does once it has consumed the bad object. So in the physical security world, it's like the cupbearer that tastes the food for the king, and then once you observe that the cupbearer is displaying a known bad behavior, becoming nauseous or dies or something along those lines, you can infer that the object that was ingested was bad. So malware sandboxing on the file level has come out in the last few years, which has done a whole lot in revolutionizing how we detect not yet known malware. And on the network side, we can look for known bad network behaviors, like scanning the network, using prohibited protocols or unsafe protocols, as John had mentioned. Host-based intrusion prevention systems, or HIPS, also looks for bad behaviors, known bad behaviors on the endpoints, like deleting files on the endpoints or reading the entire address list and sending out spam, those types of things. Security managers like SIMs, what they like to do is look for patterns or types of behaviors around the network that would be known bad. And then anomaly-based detection is very similar to behavioral-based detection, but instead of looking for known bad behaviors, it's looking for a mathematical deviation from known good behavior. So a very simple example of this would be a machine that always communicates over HTTPS begins accepting sockets on Telnet or SSH. Not necessarily a bad behavior, but anomalous in the context of that set of that type of host. Another example of anomaly detection would be a host that normally, an end user that normally collects maybe 10 or 20 megs of data from the network in a given day, but in a specific day collects a much higher number, maybe a terabyte or a gigabyte or several large transfers, which cumulatively indicate something that's outside of normal, not necessarily bad. And so when you look at these from an academic perspective, anomaly-based detection helps us build new behaviors or detect new things to look for. Things like heartbleed is a good example of this. We were seeing weird, meaning not normal or not anticipated connections to web servers, the profiles of client byte ratios, those types of metrics, mathematical metrics, which allowed us to create behaviors to look for. We now know if we see those types of connections coming to servers that they're associated with some type of web attack. Behavioral checks also feed signatures. So when malware sandboxing catches a new zero-day attack, we're able to identify what that malware is, give it a name, and then create a signature, so we're catching it at the signature level. And so all three of these things are necessary in feeding the next tier. Operationally, signature-based detection is the best for catching known exploits, best for in a number of ways. One, because the available data can be checked and a decision can be made. The evolution from signature-based IDS to IPS was possible because the fidelity or the confidence in what something was allowed us to make a decision to what to do to it. In the same vein, behavioral-based detection allows us to catch zero-day exploits or zero-day attacks, malware that is doing the same thing once it gets into a machine, but is using a new exploit to get in. So we might not be able to detect that it's malware, but once it's in the machine, it's scanning the network, it's deleting files, it's encrypting files for ransomware, those types of things. And anomaly-based detection, on top of creating new behaviors, is also best able to detect what I call credential abuse attacks, meaning attacks that are connected to the use of the insider's login, so stolen credentials. There's no malware to detect. We can't alert when someone's accessing a file because they're supposed to access a file. Edward Snowden is a good example of this. Booz Allen hired him to administer NSA servers, so he had to connect. So you couldn't alarm on a signature saying a Booz administrator just connected to a server because that's what they're supposed to do. But there was a normal amount of data to be collected, a normal amount of connections that would occur over a period of time. And the traffic profile for Edward Snowden was radically outside of normal, outside of what the baseline for those types of administrators would have been. So there's really no other way to catch it from a network perspective outside of counting things and doing anomaly-based detection. So the visibility for this, the nice thing when we're doing behavioral or anomaly detection on the network is it's a metric-based game. When we look at signature-based detection, it's very important to have deep information, to look at the packets, to be certain that the packet or the file does match, because you don't want a false positive and disrupt service. But when you're doing behavioral or anomaly-based detection, you're just really counting things. How many of these types of packets are on the network? How many, what is the distribution of the service profiles? And so because of that, NetFlow, around 2004, LandCope started using NetFlow as a primary method for gathering telemetry because it has those metrics in it. It has the things to count. It's lightweight, and we can very often do a North American deployment of monitoring every communication in the network in under a day. And so because of that low cost, it's not intrusive, we don't have to go inline, leveraging the existing infrastructure. There's many business cases for using NetFlow, for doing the detection. And beyond that, as John mentioned, it provides an audit trail. So once we detect something, so the first thing we want to do is block something. If we can't block it, we need to detect it. And once we detect it, we need the data to investigate what happened so that we can determine impact and change the way that we're blocking and detecting things. And so NetFlow is one of those important data sources. There's going to be a need for packet capture in parts of the network. As John mentioned, you're going to need system logs, and then there's going to be some times when we have to do endpoint forensics. Just very briefly on let's see what has happened here. On LandCope. Okay, so LandCope's been around since 2000. Our research started on a product called StealthWatch at that time and came to market in 2001, and we've been leading the market in network behavioral anomaly detection, forensic response, and really gathering all the telemetry from the network for producing actionable intelligence inside of an organization. One of the ways that we've termed this is network as a sensor. Again, leveraging NetFlow as the data source. And so instead of deploying probes, and there's some times where we need probes, but for the most part we can resolve deep network visibility just by leveraging the router and switch interface data. And so what that actually tells us is several things. It'll tell us every host. So if we see a communication coming from a host, we know the host exists. We can build profiles based upon that host information. And one quick note about NetFlow as it concerns security is a lot of tools process NetFlow to really monitor the roadways, the health of the network and the interfaces and the routers and the switches. The way StealthWatch is using it is really monitoring the endpoint. So if you think about my roadway example, it would be we're monitoring the cars using the data coming off of the NetFlow instead of monitoring the health of the roads, though we can do some of that. But inventorying every host on the network passively, we can determine what services they're producing, what's serving out, what services they're consuming, who they're communicating with, the quantities of all of that. So, and that can be done really instantaneously as soon as we turn the system up. It does record every conversation at a meta level. So if we determine from another tool, maybe it's sandboxing or signature-based IPS or, God forbid, Brian Krebs or someone else calling, we can go back and say there was an endpoint that was infected at a point in time, or an insider, a user that was abusing privilege. We can go back and look at every conversation internally that host had with other hosts. Did it touch something inside of a protected PCI scope or something that contained intellectual property? Baseline, again, what is normal? Looking for not just looking for known bad behaviors, but also establishing what does a normal operation look like and alerting when there's a deviation. And the deviation may be security related, or it may just be some fluctuation caused by business change. Alert to that, sort for months, and then render the information in the most appropriate way. And so, with that said, these are some resources. These will be made available after the presentation that you can go and dig deeper into this. But with that said, Tim, I think we can turn it over back to you for some Q&A.
Great, thanks, Charles. That it was great to hear you walk through some of the methodology there. A really good summary of how you guys have approached it, and the behavior piece of this is also interesting. I have a couple of questions of my own, but let me offer to the audience here first. Before we start the Q&A, I'm going to ask if the audience will fill out the feedback form that's open on your computer. To complete the form, please press the Submit Answer button at the bottom of the page. Thanks in advance for filling out the feedback form. Your participation in the survey allows us to better serve you. And now on to the Q&A. As a reminder, to participate, just type your question into the text box located below the media player and then click the Submit Question button. We have one question that I thought was interesting. Where does application whitelisting or code signing fall in the signature behavior anomaly detection triad?
Right. That's a great question. So there's the signature behavioral anomaly detection, it would fall into anomaly detection in that you whitelist everything that's normal, which is what a whitelist is. These applications are the approved applications, so if I see anything outside of that, that's abnormal. I didn't cover it here today, but there's different scopes that we apply that to. Obviously, we talked about file coming in. We talked about packets. This also could apply to monitoring human beings, applications in this case. But yeah, application whitelisting would be in the anomaly space, where you would determine there's some mechanism for determining what is the whitelist, whether it's manual or calculated, and then you would alert outside of that.
Okay. There's a question in here about SDN, and I know that's an emerging area for a lot of folks in the networking space. What's the impact of SDN on, sort of the way you look at security, or maybe, John, in your case, maybe ways that attackers might look at the network?
Well, my biggest concern with SDN is the same concern we had with virtualization, and that's a lack of visibility. And once you start virtualizing network components into these big chassis, you lose a little bit that you had before. But the nice thing is that there's so many features and so many things that you can take advantage of. I think it's providing a lot of capabilities that are going to advance us to where we will be able to start making decisions on traffic much faster. We'll be able to analyze that traffic much faster and make decisions, which is going to be nice, and especially for a company like Landcope. I think it's going to definitely aid them, and I'm kind of curious actually to see what Charles says about it.
Yeah, so it's actually something that we were prepared for before it was a thing. Funny enough, one of the fundamental pieces of doing behavioral and anomaly detection on the network is a concept called enclaving, and what that means is grouping like things together. You build baselines not on each host, but on a group of hosts. So how do email servers operate? So you have to group email servers together. How do email servers work with VPN users or VPN connections? And so inside of StealthWatch, there is we call by function. We also have by location, but other groupings are called host groups, and grouping like machines together, like entities together. So in that regard, we've had an SDN type of approach to monitoring the network well before SDN started rolling out, and it's put us in an interesting place because we had to monitor that way. And when you look at something like a PCI scope, where you may have POS machines distributed geographically across the globe, we can put each one of those point-of-sales machines into a single enclave, into a single host group, which is very similar to SDN. The other thing that's happening along the SDN space is Cisco's TrustSec. And if you're not familiar with that, it's classifying every asset on the network with some amount of business logic. So this endpoint happens to belong to a trusted employee, and this is his personal device. And then you start making decisions on access, ACL, access control list type of decisions based upon how that machine is tagged with what's called a security group tag. And so StealthWatch, as of 6.7, already supports the ingestion of security group tagging, which is really an SDN type of tag on not just each asset, which we do, but also each packet. How is that packet actually categorized in the business logic? So it is an exciting world, and frankly, it's good for security detection, at least from Landcope's perspective.
Okay, thank you. Just as a reminder to the audience, if you have a question, just type it into the text box below the media player and then click Submit Question. There's a question here about changes, and I think they're referring to change management. I know I hear a lot about whether in the network side people make router configuration changes, or on the security side maybe firewall configuration changes that no one else knows about, they're not documented, and you run into security issues as a result. What can you tell us about what we can do to improve that that whole process so that we're not, configuring ourselves into a problem? Either one of you have a thought?
Sure. So part of it is monitoring. When I was in an operational role doing network security, we would monitor both through VA scanning, right? So active VA scanning that would scan the network for different types of assets for classification, but also network monitoring, like something like StealthWatch. Will go and observe every conversation and then alert when something is out of scope. And so there's two main ways we do it inside of StealthWatch. One is if a protected service like email, if we see something that's accepting email sockets or sending email out, and it's not classified inside of StealthWatch as an email server, it's going to alert. Same thing with the network scanner or other important functions on the network. And so part of the change control process for our customers is the security team is updated to a change control, or the IP management system, the IPAM system, the database controlling changes, feeds and updates the StealthWatch classifications. But if that doesn't happen, if the information is not shared with the monitoring group, the Security Operations Center, or whoever is doing compliance monitoring or change control monitoring, there will be an alert saying this machine is not authorized to do what it's doing on the network. It's either performing known bad behaviors or anomalous behaviors for how it's classified. And lastly, we do have an ability to go and say there's a new host on the network or a new segment. This is dark space. There shouldn't be a host there, and now we have one or more hosts showing up in a part of the network that shouldn't have anything. So, but yeah, in addition to what we do, I do recommend VA scanning. I don't know if you have anything else on top of that, John.
No, not from the network side. You nailed it exactly what I was thinking, and what I've seen from the product in the past. But I was thinking more from the what I've seen in some testing where we inadvertently made changes on the network. We plugged into a system that had network access control. I don't remember the NAC product that they had, but we were able to bypass it because the way the switch was configured, it allowed us to turn the port into a trunk port because it had DTP enabled. And the client actually caught us that way because they detected a change using Tripwire, because they had Tripwire monitoring their network device configurations. And as soon as we used Yersinia to switch that port into a trunk and then gain access to the server LAN where we wanted to start attacking, probably within about 15, 20 minutes, we had someone from the network ops group come down and say, hey, did you guys hack a switch or make a change to a switch? And we hadn't, and it turns out it was the running config. So this is just an example of how something that that's monitoring change can detect an attack there.
Just to follow up on that point, do you both work with lots of enterprises, and one of the things that we hear is that there's frequently a disconnect between what may happen in security operations and what may happen in network operations, and that sometimes things fall between the cracks between those two organizations. Do you have any thoughts on do you see that happening, and what can organizations do to kind of improve the communications between the security side and the network side?
I'd say the biggest thing is to help them realize they're on the same team and that they're working towards the same goal. And in many cases, what they're doing will overlap or complement each other. So building teamwork and a relationship between those groups is huge, and getting them sitting down like a weekly brown bag lunch or things of that nature where you're establishing, this is the other team, this is what they're doing, this is how you can get more involved, and let's, start working together and try to be more efficient. When you have more of a SecOps and NetOps group that's together in a big SOC, they're so much more effective than when they're in disparate locations or there's infighting and that type of thing.
Charles, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. One of the things that I find is deficient in almost every organization, from the largest to the smallest, is documented process. We tend to be very, not very heavy, but to have adequate or at least some semblance of policy. We have tools, but we don't have the flowcharts that connect the different people together and what handoff looks like, and that causes a number of issues. And one of them, as you're pointing out, Tim, is that there's no clear way to hand off a problem. And so you can't audit it. You also can't teach it either. So one of the exercises that I like to do is in a security scenario when we're talking about tools or improving things, and do a lot of assessments with partners, is get everyone in the room, the operator level folks, and ask questions like, what do we do when there's a malware problem? And so everyone gets to, we whiteboard it out, who does what, and then we take that information and build it into a better process. And so a process is a big part of it, and then also just making sure you have tools that have sufficient overlap. Everyone's always looking for gap analysis. We don't want to have tools that are doing the same thing, and that's a good exercise. But it's also important to have some level of overlap, because if you don't, there's going to be a gap. There's no way to hand off from one tool to another. And honestly, when I was using Stealth Watch operationally, I had a very contentious relationship with the NOC and those folks on the network side. And the only thing that really helped us out was process and tools that bridge the gap. And network security tends to be where we have that handoff. So, but process, flowcharts, the world would be a lot happier with more flowcharts.
Okay, thanks. We have time for maybe just a couple more questions. To remind everyone that if you'd like to ask a question, just type it into the text box below the media player and click Submit Question. There's a question here. I'll just read it verbatim, and you guys can see how you want to approach it. It has to do with networks versus applications. How do both of you think about network assets versus application assets? How would I monitor my applications? Because today's apps can be heavy on client-side interaction only, such as single-page apps. That's how it's written. But I think what they're sort of getting at is that when you're doing your monitoring, looking at the differences between network assets and application assets, how do you go about doing that? Do either of you want to take a crack at that one?
I'll try. I'll buy John some time. So they're different scopes, right? We really have we have 4 scopes to focus on. At least. One is endpoint. We spend a lot of time hardening so that the endpoint's not compromised, so that it can't pivot and exploit applications. Focusing on the network for monitoring client-to-server communications, client-to-client communications. We have the human level as well, and then the application assets. So it is important to look at applications, particularly those that are internet-facing, right? Because they become a pretty powerful pivot point. We've seen several examples of that where third-party servers were compromised. Attacks, several of the attacks in recent days have been because of application security. So you can't skip it, right? I don't think it's a one or the other type of answer. If you're triaging, what do you do? Network security is going to catch the attack later. You can protect an application by hardening the application, and then from a performance or an application performance monitoring or APM perspective, for business services, you're going to have to monitor those as well. But it's a balance, right? You have to do all of those things. You can't watch one, and you're really going to be only as strong as the weakest of them. So having really strong network security doesn't relieve you from having good application security. All right, John, that's the best I can do.
Well, I was going to focus a little more on the application side, because I think one of the issues is that there's often not a lot of visibility in from the network perspective, because these more critical apps are going to have encryption, so that unless you're doing some type of SSL offloading or something of that sort, from the network side, you're not really going to have visibility into the application. So you're going to have to rely on the application's logs. When the developers were creating the app, did they put in logging? Are you stuck relying on Apache or JBoss or some application server's request logs? Or was the developer, thinking ahead and actually put in some really nice logging and application functionality that's going to give you that audit trail that's going to give you a little more perspective as to what's going on in the app? And that's going to be a combination of having a secure development lifecycle and having your developers understand these are the things that are necessary so that we can fully monitor the application and know when things are going bad, when it's getting attacked, and understand the critical areas of those apps and where the data is stored and how an attacker might want to go after it.
Okay, well, thanks, guys. We're running into the top of the hour here, so there's one or two questions that we didn't get to. We will have those, and we'll be able to answer those in email. So we will try to get back to you when we can. But we'll, in the interest of time, we'll wrap up here. So for more information related to today's webinar, please visit any of the resource links that are open before you. Within the next 24 to 48 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Additionally, you can view today's event on demand by visiting darkreading.com/events. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Improving Cybersecurity Through Next-Generation Network Defenses, brought to you by Dark Reading and LandCope. This webinar is copyright 2015 by UBM. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted, if that's the case, by Dark Reading and LandCope, who are solely responsible for its content, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guests, John Sawyer and Charles Herring, I'm Tim Wilson. Thanks for your time, and have a great day.